No, we're good. No, I'll be fine. Just get me started. Yeah, I will be fine. Not to worry.
Okay. And Mark.
And I'm looking at you.
You're just looking at me. It's just
We're having a conversation.
How are you? Oh my God.
I am so tired right
You're
now,
so
but I'm not going to show it on camera.
Why are you tired? First tell me why you're tired.
The Surdna Foundation just had a day and a half board meeting that started with a Sunday dinner and ended with lunch on Tuesday, which is our normal routine. And by the end of those 2 days, I'm usually ready for a nap.
And what was one of the highlights from this recent board meeting?
Well, we had a very interesting, so this is a November board meeting, which is, we do 4 board meetings a year. And the meeting in November is what we call our learning meeting. So the idea is that once a year, you've made some bets, and at the end of the year, you say, well, so how'd we do? And so this is the meeting where we reflect with the board on kind of how we did. What were our assumptions a year ago? How have facts on the ground changed? What have we learned in the process? How have we adjusted the work that we do? And so at this meeting, we have a lot of time, a day-long, really, conversation about this, so we try to keep it from just being PowerPoint slides or a big lecture. So we changed formats, and we had a variety of fun formats this time. We have done 2 years in a row something we call the Ideas Marketplace. So we create these little 3 or 4 simultaneous conversations scattered around the office, and board members rotate among them half an hour or 45 minutes per conversation, so they learn from staff different tidbits of what's happened throughout the year. So we did that this year. And then also this year we had 2 board members who decided that as members of one of the committees, they wanted to help present some of the ideas. So what they decided to do is they pretended to be Phil Donahue and Oprah Winfrey, and they interviewed on national television one of our program officers to ask her about the work we're doing on minimum wage and job quality. And it was pretty hilarious. We set up a sort of studio audience setting in the upstairs of our offices, and everyone went up and we went into pretend mode for about half an hour, and the talk show was called, instead of 60 minutes, it was called 30 minutes, and they had mugs with 30-minute logos on them, and we did the tick, 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 like 60 minutes. We did the whole thing. It was really, really entertaining, and our board members it was their idea. So it was a way to have fun and learn about issues at the same time, and that's sort of when you're talking for a full day, you actually have to figure out ways to penetrate those sort of moments where you get a little bit ready for a nap, like just after lunch or just toward the end of the day.
Are there photos?
Are there photos? I'm sure there are photos. I actually don't know. They're hopefully not on Facebook, and they're not on Instagram or anything like that. I imagine somebody has made photos. Yes, there's a long history of Surdna doing slightly wacky things. I recall some going away dinners and other things where we have wild T-shirt slogans and funny baseball caps and all kinds of things. It's a bit of the sort of familyness of Surdna that you have to, I think, keep in mind when you do the work. So.
And not boring. So it sounds not boring at all.
No, not boring. Always an adventure at the Surdna Foundation.
So
My name is Philip Henderson, Phil Henderson. I'm the president of the Surdna Foundation. I've been the president now for just coming up on 8 years. I am not a member of the family, although some presidents of family foundations are actually family members. I'm the second professional president of the Surdna Foundation. I took over for Ed Skloot, who had been here for nearly 19 years when he left just before my arrival. Isn't it funny when I'm talking, I don't care about the sirens. Whatever, the sirens are fine.
okay? Should we try that again? Do it just again.
I can hear it again.
Well, we are in Manhattan, and it could be natural. This doesn't have to be a studio.
So would you want to do the whole thing again?
I guess just say your name.
Okay, I'm Philip Henderson. I'm the president of the Surdna Foundation, where I've been for 8 years, the second ever professional executive director, now president of the foundation. In its nearly 100-year history, I took over for Ed Skloot, who had been here for nearly 19 years.
What's one thing that excites you about your job currently?
So being the president of the Surdna Foundation is not an easy job. It's not like I wake up in the morning and think, gee, what am I going to do for the day? It's really a very demanding job, but it's a remarkable institution. I mean, we are 97 years old, coming up on 100 years old, and I feel like in some ways I'm the caretaker of a very important philanthropy, a legacy, an institution that a family has owned and loved for generations. And so there's an enormous amount of responsibility and possibility that comes with doing this job. I mean, we spend, more than $40 million a year on doing good work in the United States. And that's a pretty neat thing to be able to do. And so I get this opportunity to both work with tremendous staff people who are experts on the work that we've chosen to do, but this great family that's behind the institution, people who just love the Surdna Foundation. And that's a pretty interesting organization, institutional setup to try to lead. And so it's really challenging, really an honor, really fun at times, sometimes makes you pull your hair out, but for the most part, it's really a tremendous opportunity. I had to say the hair thing. I mean, really, the hair. I mean, really, I did not have hair when I got here, I promise. So one of the things about Surdna, I mean, one of the things about working in an institution where the board members are predominantly family members is you have sort of two pieces of that. There are two results of the fact that these people are family. One is that they're not people who come to this work because they're experts, right? We don't have family members who are simultaneously, for the most part, experts in the work that we're doing in the philanthropy. On the other hand, they have sort of built-in passion for the foundation itself and for the values of the foundation and to carry the foundation forward. So you have people who are deeply devoted. And in most institutions, most nonprofit institutions, and I would say probably for-profit institutions, one of the central challenges of those institutions is board members who are board members in name only. There are a list of people on the letterhead. Some of the names are names you might recognize. Some of them are fancy people that are important to have as members of the board of directors, but they don't do anything. And they're not really always very committed to the work of the institution. They rely on the staff almost entirely to carry the institution forward. In this situation, that's not the case at all. We're kind of all in this together. And we all sort of see this as a shared set of responsibilities. The board members are not all family members. We have 13 board members, of which 10 are family members. They have a certain role in managing or really overseeing the growth and development of the foundation over time. And then they employ us as professional staff people to actually carry out the work. And they really rely on me to be the translator between the board, the non-experts, people who are passionate about the mission, passionate about the legacy of the institution, and the experts who are the staff, who are the ones who are actually touching and feeling the work every day. And it's quite a thing because everyone feels fully committed to the work that we're doing. They all play slightly different roles, but I don't have to cajole anybody. I don't have to try to convince the board members that they should spend their time on this. They're champing at the bit to actually be with us in the work. And so that's a great feature of this institution. Yeah. So I came to the Surdna Foundation from outside of the philanthropy industry. I was not somebody who came from another foundation. I was working at a place called the German Marshall Fund in Washington, D.C., which did some grant making, but it was structured differently than a private foundation was. And so when I was learning about this job, one of the things that I was hearing from the recruiter and from my peers was running a family foundation is a different thing entirely because the family will tend to be maybe in the way, maybe imposing its will, maybe clumsy in its efforts to sort of push the work forward. And so I didn't really know. That was just what I heard because I've never done this job before, and I'd never really been on the inside of a family foundation before. So I was taking that in, and the way I imagined the job when I came here was a little bit of backseat driving. You know, trying to guide the institution without being obviously out in front, without being sort of a dominant, dictatorial CEO. Right? You sort of think of CEOs and presidents as the people who are creating the path and everyone follows them. In this case, I think the craft of family philanthropy is you're trying to elicit from the family the ideas, the values, the expression of what the work is, and you try to translate that into something that's actually meaningful. And so if I went into a board meeting, maybe the first board meeting or an early board meeting, and said to them, okay, here's what we're going to do, they would have been very quickly soured of me. Maybe they would have booted me out, because that isn't the way it works. It's really about creating the space for the conversation where you can help issues rise up, that then you can say, right, that's it. That's the thing we believe, and let's create work around that. And so it isn't about me in a way that it might be if I was running a foundation that was not a family foundation, one where there were just expert or interested board members who were seeking from me the clarity of the direction going forward. In this case, it's much more mixed. It's much more about appearing to take a step back, and in fact taking a step back while not. I mean, you know, let's be honest. It's not about creating a situation where it's carte blanche. They can do whatever. It's really about trying to guide the institution, not by front seat driving, but from the back.
So that-
Some of that you may not want to publish, but we'll see.
No, I think
Yeah, so when I arrived here, as I said, I was the second professional executive director. So Ed Skloot had been here for about 19 years. He had come in with a job of trying to push the institution from being a pretty closely held family institution into a sort of modern philanthropy with programs and strategies. And so over 19 years, that institution was built step by step by step. And when I arrived at the foundation, I think that the summary is it was time for a change. It was time for something new. And one of the signals for that was, well, there were a couple things. One is there were 5 programs. The newest program of those 5 was already a decade old. So there were programs that had been around for quite some time. Many of them were managed by people who had been the founding directors of the programs back, 15 plus years earlier. And so my arrival was really the first step toward what eventually became a sort of transformation of the organization. And one of the things that was happening when I arrived here was the board was really having trouble figuring out, of those 5 areas, and we were doing everything from youth development to work on climate change to arts education. All of them were really interesting fields, but the board was trying to figure out, well, which one of these things do we do more of? Which one of these things do we do less of? If we're going to grow, do we grow all the programs equally? Do we grow only arts education or only the work in climate? And so they'd been really struggling with that problem. And one of the things they were trying to do is collect information, data, to try to figure out what they could learn about how effective these programs had been. And so I came in with fresh eyes, and I said, data is not going to help you, because let's take, for example, maybe your arts programming is going amazingly well. What do you conclude from that? Does that mean you give it more money? Or do you give it less money because it's so efficient in the use of the money? If a program is struggling, let's say our climate change work isn't going well, do we retool and deepen the investment, or do we walk away? Well, the answer to that isn't a data answer, it's a values answer, right? It depends on what you care about. And so one of the observations I had when I came here was the foundation didn't have a coherent answer to the what are we all here to do, actually? Like, what is the North Star? What is all this supposed to add up to? And so at the time, the mission statement was one of those generic mission statements that many institutions have that was not very helpful in determining what the course of actual action should be. And so I suggested to the board about 6 months after I was here, we should do some work on mission. We should actually try to answer the question, not how do we run all the programs that we're doing already well, but let's stop for a minute and ask ourselves, given what we've been doing, given the values that we espouse, what is it that all that should add up to? And so that was really what became a months-long, really year-long process to develop a statement for our mission, which is about sustainable communities and a strong expression of social justice and work in environment, economy, and culture, which embraces the DNA of the foundation. It wasn't like we made something up from scratch. We actually tried to connect what we had been doing to what we wanted to do next. And that statement really became the thing that animated how the foundation would go through change. It would be the thing that forced us to then make good on, okay, well, if you care about that mission, if that's what you're trying to do, you need to create programs that actually add up to that kind of change. And so we were able to reassemble basically these 5 programs, shut a couple of them down, pull some ideas through others, and create 3 new program areas that we're pretty proud of. We're pretty happy. And the great thing about all of that was when we were done, everybody, staff and board, could all tell the same story. Board members, if you stopped any of them in any elevator in North America and you said, board member of the Surdna Foundation, so what do you guys do? They would be able to talk about the work that we're doing in a way that was really not possible beforehand, because they have a sense of what the common purpose is of the institution. How did the actual thing happen? Well, so you know, the story of drafting the mission statement is both a long story and a short story. The short story is we sat in the library hotel, which is just a couple of blocks away from the Surdna Foundation, for an 8-hour day in retreat, the board members and me and a facilitator, and we created the 2 sentences. We went over each word, we figured out what we wanted to say, and we had a mission statement. And the next day we announced it to staff, and the staff all applauded because I think they were relieved that we didn't do anything crazy. So it's, in a way, it took us a day. But the reality is we actually built a conversation over the course of the previous year, or the year leading up to that, which was, which was really me, because I was new. So they had to first trust me that I wasn't going to go off and do the Phil Henderson Foundation, right? I was going to do the Surdna Foundation with them. And so we did things like look back at old documents and say, what are the words that we always use when we talk about the things we're excited about? We looked at statements of our values. What are the values that keep rising up? Values of modesty and thrift and innovation and other things that we talk about a lot at Surdna. And then I sort of did some contrarian thinking. I said, so we all would agree we're not going to start investing in aerospace. And we all would agree we're not going to start doing medical research in this new era of the Surdna Foundation. So why is it that we know that? Like, what is it that's in the back of our minds that tells us that there are things that are Surdna and things that are not Surdna? And so that's where things like community-based work came up, and wanting to be involved in systems reform and not just solving the particular problem for a particular homeless population, but really looking at what are the systems reforms needed that help these things from being created in the first place. Those are Surdna-like things to do. And I think we all kind of knew that, but it was going through a many-layered conversation where we got really moved toward the same page that allowed us on that one day to sit down and assemble all of that into 2 sentences. And we had great board members. We had just the right group of people. We had board members who were younger generation, older generation family members. We had 2 very thoughtful outside non-family members who were part of the board, who were really effective in helping to help the board not feel afraid, feel like this was actually the right thing to do, and we could do it well, and we could be proud of it. And so I think that sort of reassurance was really important, and it helped us get started. So let me tell you, I think what's something that's important that you've heard some before, but it's important to say. I think there there were, so we've talked a little bit about the mission moment being a key moment in this next era. But I think it's important also to know that there were some stage setting events that happened at the foundation even 10 years earlier that helped us get to the place where that was possible. And I think two of them were the fact that the board decided to create term limits for itself for the family members, so that family members were no longer serving for life or until they got bored. They were actually term limited, which had the important effect. This was not about clearing out the deadwood. It wasn't about getting rid of anybody. It was about trying to create space for the next generation of the family. And so what that meant was, so that was adopted sometime in the late 90s. So by the early 2000s, 3 or 4 years before I arrived, new family members began to come onto the foundation board. And so now every couple of years, we have a new set of younger family members who are coming on. And they're fundamentally changing, as happens when you bring new people onto a board, new sense of what this institution should be, really set the stage for a changing and evolving sense of what Surdna Foundation could be. The second piece was that the board decided for the first time that they wanted to bring on non-family members. And the sort of cliche, the sort of funny cliche, which turns out to be true, is that when family members have guests at the table, they behave differently. And so the temptation to bring family business to the table or to bring family squabbles to the table was lessened significantly when there were other professionals at the table who were there because of their devotion to the Surdna Foundation, who really didn't have a lot of interest in the inter-family, dirty laundry perhaps, or baggage that comes with any large family. So that allowed the foundation's board to become a much more professional, focused group. And so those two things had happened before I arrived, but they were present when the foundation had the opportunity or had the need to change leadership. And so the board that brought me in was really primed for trying to figure out what the next phase of Surdna's work would be. And without those things that they did, without those term limits, the things that seem sort of esoteric and not terribly important turn out to be critical building blocks to getting the foundation ready to be what it is now, actually. And we now have a completely different feel to the foundation that's the result of those two things, outside board members and the continual arrival of new family voices, that makes the foundation a totally different place than it was in 1994 or 1984 or 1974. I can do that. So, to an outsider, the Surdna Foundation seems like an enormous institution. We have $1 billion in assets in our endowment. And $1 billion sounds like it is an enormous amount of money, more than I'll ever see in my lifetime, certainly. But the illusion is interesting because actually the stuff that we've chosen to take on, the creation of sustainable communities, trying to figure out how you get strong local economies to actually happen in communities across the US, how you figure out how next generation infrastructure, meaning the infrastructure that's not the stuff we built 110 years ago, but stuff that's actually using the tools and technology and the innovation that we know today to actually happen, takes way more money than we would ever have, right? $1 billion, even if we spent all $1 billion this year, we couldn't really by ourselves make the kind of change that we think is needed. Because creating systems change is very complex business that takes a long time, and requires a lot of people working together. And so one of the things that we hold true at Surdna is we don't have enough money. So it isn't about us. It isn't about us owning the Surdna issue and we're going to solve the Surdna issue. It's about us understanding that we operate in an ecosystem. We operate in an ecosystem with lots of institutions that are trying to make change with us. And so the best thing we can do is try to use our various weaponry, our money, our name, our smart staff people, the networks that we know, to actually move in concert to make change happen. And I think, if you're at the Gates Foundation, I think you can sometimes imagine you have enough money to solve problems all by yourself. We don't ever have that, we don't ever believe that's so. And so our basic approach is a collaborative one. It's working in partnership with other institutions, other philanthropies, the Ford Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, et cetera, working with local governments, working with the corporate sector, where we see opportunities for us to work together to make change happen. And the flip side of that, or the sort of, if you stop looking externally and you look internally, we've created 3 program areas: strong local economies, thriving cultures, sustainable environments. And when we were creating them, after we created the mission statement, we were drawing them as circles on a page. And we drew them, as people often do, as 3 overlapping circles. And we spent a lot of time talking about what do those overlaps mean. So what is it that's happening where economy and environment overlap? What's happening where environment and culture overlap? And how can we be operating in those spaces through grant making, through moving ideas, to actually create change? Because communities don't operate in an economic silo and an environmental silo. And communities are places where people live, and they interact as people in a very complex set of systems that don't easily get sliced into these nice, neat, siloed, I don't know what. And so we have to, as an institution, be responsive to that complexity. And so we're looking internally about how we learn from each other, how our economy people learn from the environment people, how they work together to see where problem solving can happen in real communities or in real policy making settings that's responsive to that complexity, and not sort of artificially saying, we're just solving it's just a jobs problem, or it's just an environment problem. Actually, these things work together. To solve a real environmental problem, you have to be thinking about the economic impact. You have to think about how real people interact with that, and that requires both sides of your economy brain and your environment brain to be working together. So we try, as an institution, internally to model that, and it creates sort of different opportunities for us externally as well. I just saw them, by the way. Roger and Deanna were both together. They were at the Brunner Loeb Forum that we did. I'll tell the story because I'm on camera. So we, last week, were a part of something called the Brunner Loeb Forum, which is an annual forum that is at the Brunner, I don't know the names of these institutions. The Brunner Foundation and the Loeb Foundation do together. In this case, we were involved because the host institution is the Enterprise Community Partners, which is a national organization that works on community development. And we have been working with them on a fellowship program, the name of which I'm forgetting. George, what the hell's the name of this?
Rose Architectural Fellow.
So we work with the Enterprise Community Partners, which hosted this Brunner Loeb Forum. We work with them on something called the Rose Architectural Fellows, which is a fellowship program that tries to put people who do architecture work and design work in community-based organizations to do this work, not just to do a fancy building in Midtown Manhattan, but actually to do work to help the design and effective change of community, bringing an architectural eye and a design eye to the sort of community development work that happens all the time. And so this was a great place where some of our grantees came to talk about that work. And one of the grantees that was there were the 2 founders of Juxtaposition Arts, which is a group that we've been funding for quite some time in North Minneapolis, Minnesota, where they have actually created opportunities for young people who are artists or are interested in being artists or design folks to come in, high school age kids, a little bit beyond high school, to learn skills and to actually understand how those skills can translate into economic opportunity, can translate into real work. And so Juxtaposition is a great example of how you can take this sort of academic expertise that often that's deployed to create beautiful art museums and actually bring it into real communities and bring it in a way that actually enlivens those communities, not just beautify them, but actually enliven them in a way that can create economic momentum, can be an expression of the real cultural heritage of these places, can make them lively places where people want to live. Well, I'm searching for the name. It's interesting, the question of how do artists make a living? How do they make ends meet? So we've been funding arts education for a long time, and our current program has moved from just strictly arts education to what we call thriving cultures, trying to understand how arts and culture create the fabric for communities. But one of our legacy pieces was doing lots of arts training, working with after-school programs, conservatories, summer arts programs of a variety of stripes. And what we learned after we'd been doing this for a while was these institutions, particularly the ones that are high school or college level formal education opportunities, they had almost no idea what was happening to their alumni. They weren't, we think of American higher educational institutions as being incredibly sophisticated about tracking their alumni, mostly because they want to get cash back. But in this case, it had a double effect, right? One was they didn't have a great alumni base to be able to get donations back to their institutions, but also they weren't entirely sure whether the training they were providing the arts kids was actually translating into real work for these kids, what they were doing. And so we, with really under our leadership at Surdna, we created something called SNAP, the Strategic National Arts, SNAAP, Strategic National Arts Alumni Program. And what this was, the Strategic National Arts Alumni Program, was oh, sorry. That's okay, because I can say again, because I didn't know what SNAP was. You don't know about SNAP, George?
I know SNAP.
Okay,
but
you
I
just
don't
didn't know what
I
it meant.
forgot what it-
It used to be the Surdna National Arts, but then it became strategic when we didn't want to fully own it anymore. I'll try to start sort of from the beginning. So one of the things that we learned when we were doing lots of funding in arts education was the arts education institutions really didn't know very well what was happening to their alumni, which was which created two problems. One was they didn't have a great alumni base to be able to get donations back, and the second was, it's okay because I waved the fly away in the middle of that too. So. Okay, so we funded the creation of something called the Strategic National Arts Alumni Project, which is a sort of funny name. It's called SNAP. And the purpose of that was to try to help colleges and high schools, conservatories that were training artists to figure out what was happening to their alumni. In particular, what were their alumni doing professionally after they left these institutions? And so this survey instrument, which was the creation of which was masterminded by Vanderbilt University and Indiana University, was provided to institutions across the United States who paid for the service to track what happened to their alumni. And what we found was a very high percentage of artists continue to do their art. But the way most of them do it is by assembling other economic work around it. Multiple jobs, but the fascinating thing was they keep doing their art. And the satisfaction level that they had with that, with having done that training, and the sort of life experiences they've had as a result of that makes them, on average, more content with their lot than the average graduate from university. So it's a fascinating thing, and it doesn't directly answer the question of whether arts institutions are providing the exactly right kind of training, but it has begun to help these institutions figure out if they should be providing more business courses or entrepreneurship courses or other things that can create the hard skills that might go with the artistic skills that allow those folks to translate their experience into maybe not full-time work, because there are not a lot of people in the world who make a living doing full-time artistic work, at least in the United States, where we don't have largesse coming from the national government. But at least finding a way to weave that in effectively and not having to learn that over 15 years, but maybe being able to find their way sooner after they graduate. Not on point, but it's an interesting story.
It's just a question for us, we're like, why did I go to film school and not?
Yeah, I have a good story on that. I can tell a good story on that.
Great.
I have stock stories on pretty much everything. So, you know, one of the things you have to worry about when you're at a family institution is worry is not exactly the right word. You have to be attentive to the values, right? And one of the values that has been carried forward throughout Surdna's maybe 97-year history, I don't know if it's always been there, but it feels like it's always been there, and that's modesty. And modesty, in particular in this modern era, has really been an important defining attribute to the foundation. And one of the things that I observed is that modesty was being conflated with anonymity. So the modesty meant not just not wanting to thump ourselves in the chest and take full credit, but modesty was also being effectively anonymous. And, you know, we're a foundation with a funny name. We're Surdna Foundation, not Andrus Foundation. And so there's something in the sort of the creation myth of the Surdna Foundation that's about not wanting to be self-congratulatory about ourselves. And that's really important. But what happened as a result of that was we were really reluctant to say much about our work or about the work of our grantees, except in a very quiet way. And we've changed that in the last 5-6 years. We've really helped the board and the board as representatives of the family see that there is a way that you can be modest, but really be passionate about the issues you're working on and be passionate about the great work that the grantees are doing. And that one of the things you really need to do to increase your impact, to actually allow the foundation to fully realize the value of the investments that we're making, is you got to communicate about that. And you don't have to communicate about how awesome the Surdna Foundation is. And in fact, there was a time when we created a short film where we were talking about Surdna's role in some grant making, and board members raised their hands and said, it's too self-congratulatory. We don't really like that tone. We really want the grantees to be more front and center. And so that said to me, there is room there. There's room to do more communicating, but we have to do it in a Surdna way. And we need to be able to create the capacities for ourselves and for our grantees to be able to talk about the work, leading with the work. That's one of the things we often talk about. Not with us, not even with the name brands of some of the grantees we work with, but what's the work? And is the work really making a difference? And how can we talk about that in ways that help other people see and maybe become investors in that same kind of work? And so that's been a real transformation. And in fact, we had at a board meeting, a very recent board meeting, we had an opportunity to talk about the strides we've made just in the last 18 months or so around strategic communications. And several of our longtime board members said, you know, I used to be nervous about this, but I'm not anymore because I now see, I get it, right? I see how helpful it is, not just for us, but for our grantees. And I don't feel worried that we're going to somehow overstep that key value of modesty. And so it's really exciting because we don't invest a huge amount of money in communications, but we try to be selective and we try to all be communicators, all of us in our own way, talking about the work, talking about what Surdna cares about, trying to advance the cause.
And one thing-
Hey, I got it right. George is happy.
No, that's great.
I'm probably not going to answer this the way you're imagining, but and maybe I'll hate myself later. I think one of the things I've learned, so we've been, well, I'll take a different tack on this. So about 1.5 years ago, the CFO here at the Surdna Foundation, Mark Devenosh, who's been here since the doors of the professional era of the foundation opened in the late 80s, handed me a document, which was a report that someone in the foundation community had done talking about how bad foundations are at archiving and how they don't really do a good job of knowing what they did in generations past. And it really hit home because I was, at the time, we were still 4+ years out from our centennial, but I realized that if you asked me a simple question, like, who were the board members of the Surdna Foundation in 1974? I would have no easy way of finding that information out, because Surdna, like many foundations, has not been very good at documenting its past. And so we recognize that that's both a problem as we approach our centennial and want to look back and talk about the work we're most proud of and talk about the legacy of the institution, that there's some research to be done, and we're going to have to do some digging through old boxes of files and really trying to recreate some of that history. But also it's a lesson for how we want to be about the information that we're going to be creating as we go forward, and how do we store that and make it useful for ourselves and for the future leaders, caretakers of this institution in the next era. So it's a problem that sort of has a backward-looking feel and a forward-looking feel. And so one of the things we decided we would do in terms of looking backward was begin to interview people. And so that's where the first idea of having interviews like these came up, because we realized that, you know, time passes and we were having a generational shift happen on the board. And so we had a number of people who really were the only folks who still had those stories in them to tell. And that the sooner we got those stories from them, in a way as a certain look into the past, the sooner we did that, the better. And one of the things I've learned as I've been involved with these films is one should be careful not to confuse the storytelling from former or long-standing members of the foundation's board or staff, with documenting history. Because actually, each of them has a different version. Each of them has a different set of stories. Each of them carries with them a sort of different mythology about how things happened in the last generation, let's just say. And for me, that's been fascinating. And I've become okay with that, because actually, it doesn't really matter what the facts were around any individual transaction or individual year. It's about the stories that people carry forward from that. And so, in effect, it's the layering of stories together and seeing where they correspond and where they might not match up. That's part of the flavoring of this. Because, you know, we may well do some archiving and create some publication or publications that try to tell a concrete story. But I think the much more interesting stuff are the people and the stories that they have to tell, and how those things interact, I think, remains to be seen. And in a way, that's kind of exciting.
I agree.
So now, see, I've buttered her bread, I've buttered your bread, so.
You think your work is done?
No, wait, who else do I have to talk about?
I'm just thinking, I don't eat butter.
Okay, wow, right. We'll do olive oil for you
But
then.
I love that, where it's like, that's not how that happened. It happened like this. It's about how people.
It's amazing how elusive this is, right? We have had some interviews that I've been privy to all of them. We've had some where there were people who I thought would be able to really pull that story back, and it's just not there anymore. And yet I'm new. I'm 7+ years in, and I've internalized a whole set of stories. I'll stop if you want me to stop. Well, it's interesting because the stories that we all own. So I have a whole bunch of stories about the foundation, you know, dating back from the 60s and 70s that I've been told by various people over the course of the 7 years. I don't know how many of them are really true, but they get repeated over and over again, and so in effect they are true, right? If they are part of the mythology. And so what's interesting is those people who lived them, who might have told me these stories 5 years ago over a cup of coffee, for them trying to pull those stories out proves to be more difficult than I imagined, actually. And yet, we as a foundation, when we bring in new staff members, when we bring in new board members, we have a whole orientation session that's really about the history of the institution. And we have a set of stories that we tell that are part of the sort of founding myth of the foundation. And I use myth in the nicest sense. It's not like this is Greek mythology that none of this happened, but it's about the accepted truth of what we believe is the right story about the foundation's 100 years, because we don't have a sophisticated set of documents that a researcher from, some PhD program in philanthropic history can go and mine in any easy way. And so I'm not sure it really matters what actually happened in 1943 or 1967. These founding stories that we carry with us are really actually the thing that inform what we're going to do next. Much like the mission. The mission was based on a set of sort of accepted knowledge about what Surdna is all about. And so I don't know whether it was the right knowledge, but it was the knowledge we had. And so it's what informs us going forward. That's okay with me. It's all been roses since I've been here, obviously. Trying to think of what would be useful for me to say that you haven't heard a million times. I think one of the most interesting things that's happened at this foundation happened before I got here. I'm not sure I'd put it in the most interesting things, but it's a fascinating development. And that is that, one of the things that's a feature of the Andrus family is there are a lot of them. There's like 400 of them, right? We've redone the family tree in the last few months, which had not been updated in 20 years, and now it is I don't know how big it is. It's 6 by 5 in tiny font, so you can see the tree. And so there's a lot of family members, but only 10 family members serve on the Surdna Foundation board. And so the question is, which 10? It's not just the ones that raise their hand and say, I'd like to do that. The foundation board in the early part, or just after the year 2000, 2001, 2003, somewhere in there, actually dealt with a situation where they had invited some new family members to join, but realized those family members did not share the values of the foundation that the rest of the family board members held dear to them. And so, in fact, the board took the action of asking those family members to step down. And that lesson was really, really important because it meant that you don't just get on this board because you're a family member. It's not just blood. It's actually blood plus some agreement with the general direction of where the foundation is going. And when you have 400 people, you can imagine that the family touches every corner of the political spectrum. It has people operating in just about any profession you could name. It has people living all across the United States who bring with them different skills and experiences. And so the question is, which ones of those are really appropriate for the Surdna board? And so part of what the board had to do, and I think the mission statement is sort of an overlay on top of that, was to get clear about what it is that they valued as a board. And so they began to be selective of family members. They actually now go through a pretty elaborate, very professional process for adding new family members to the board. The family members are nominated or nominate themselves. They send in references. Those references are checked. The family member is interviewed by the board, and the determination is then made whether this is a person that should be invited on or not. And I think that was a critical element of the modernization of the family that was born from crisis, because this had to happen because they realized how quickly it can turn sour, how difficult it is to run an institution when you have squabbling at the table over the very basic tenets of the institution. And so, that was a really rough time. I wasn't here for it, but I know from the stories that it was a really rough time where board meetings were really not pleasant at all. and where there was a lot of headbutting going on, and butting of heads, not headbutting, it's different. A lot of butting of heads that went on that made those meetings very uncomfortable for board members. And I think, so I arrived after that crisis and after the board had resolved itself to be different than it was in terms of how they would bring on new members. So I benefited from that. But then the question is, how do you extend that? How do you then get the board even more focused on what it is they want to do together and get really clear on what the mission is we're working toward, so it becomes easier and easier for people from the outside, either family members from the outside or others, to know in advance, this is what the Surdna Foundation is all about. And I'm either excited to join that or I'm not interested. And it makes you sort of build increasing momentum around the common project. Sure. So the Surdna Foundation is approaching 100 years. We are still an institution that is governed largely by family members, by design, by choice. One of the challenges that comes with that longevity is that the family grows and evolves in a way that means when a new family member is born, a baby is born, not all of them automatically think, oh, right, and I'm part of the Andrus family. Not all of the nuclear families within this tree carry with them the stories of being part of this larger family. I mean, I often ask people, so do you know 5 generations ago in your family who your great-great-great-great-grandfather is? Most people don't know, unless that person happens to be incredibly wealthy or incredibly famous. They don't know. And so one of the challenges, I think, for the foundation has been, one of the challenges that our board recognized in the late 90s, as there was a generational shift that was about to happen from the 4th generation of the family to the 5th generation of the family, was given that there isn't that natural attraction, that sort of automatic affiliation that happens, what are the things that we need to do to actually reach out to and create ties that bind with family members in the outer branches of the tree, or in the out toward the leaves, I guess you might say. And so they created a set of programs, the Andrus Family Fund, the Andrus Family Philanthropy Program, that were designed to engage with teenagers, 20-somethings, 30-somethings, in the philanthropic work of the family, eventually with, under the auspices of the Surdna Foundation. And I think that's worked beautifully. We're about 15 years into that. We've had maybe nearly 100 family members that have been engaged in one way or another through this. It's really hard to imagine what would have happened if we hadn't done that, because finding family members who were both aware and interested in the work of the Surdna Foundation would have been that much more difficult if they hadn't been cultivating this set of people within the family who were embracing that. I think the question is open, though, as we cross through 100 years and we move from a 5th generation eventually to a 6th generation 15 or 20 years from now, whether this set of programs that we're doing to engage with the family is the right set of programs, with the different way that people communicate now, the different opportunities that they have through social media and otherwise. Are these the tools we need to be using to engage family? And then, what does it mean actually to be a family foundation out in the 6th generation or beyond? No one has ever experienced this before. Foundations are a relatively modern invention. The Surdna Foundation was founded in 1917 during an era when a number of foundations that we all know, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, were founded in the 19-teens. So there are foundations that are reaching that centennial mark. Some of them have already reached it, others will be reaching it soon. Almost none of them, really in effect none of them, are still family controlled the way the Surdna Foundation is. So we're an experiment. We're really the only institution that's gotten to this yet. And so we're really inventing this as we go. There's no body of literature for us to refer to. We can't Google the answer. We're really creating the answer. And so I think we don't actually know, what is it going to mean is it possible to be a family foundation at 120 or 140 years old? I don't know. No one's ever done it before. I think we're at 100. We're feeling really good about where we are. We feel like we have really good systems to create family engagement. But I think there's an unknown as well. There's an unknown of what happens next. And in some ways, I can be an interested observer and say I'm curious to see. But for family members, there's something emotional about that. You know, there's a feeling of stewardship, ownership, obligation that they don't want to be the ones that screw this up, that cause the familyness of this institution to fall away. I mean, there's a lot of examples of foundations in American history, the Ford Foundation perhaps being the poster child for institutions that were once controlled, foundations that were once controlled by family that are no longer controlled by family. And our foundation leaders have really decided they don't want that to be the future of the foundation, at least yet. So I'm one of these people that really, really hates strategic plans. You create a beautiful strategic plan, it's got nice charts, it's got beautiful colors, and you put it in a binder and you stick it on the shelf, and then about 5 years later you do another one and you put it next to it. So I've always been a little bit reluctant to use the word strategic plan when I think about how institutions should evolve. So that sometimes means that when I'm in a leadership role, I'm okay with a little bit of chaos. We sort of kind of figure it out as we go. But not everybody's okay with that. And as board and staff members like to have a sense of direction. And so one of the things that we, well, there was a moment in a board meeting where Libby Andrus, who's a longtime board member, said, you know, I just need a roadmap. If you could just give me a roadmap, it would help me see where we're going, and then I could follow along and I could be helpful. And so the roadmap concept became our version of a strategic plan, which was, you know, this is the stuff we think we want to do, and this is the order in which we want to do it, and it's going to lead us forward, and then we'll see, and we'll course correct as we go. And one of the key components of that was that you have to have some sense of where you're going, but you also have to be pretty self-aware that you can't predict the future. And so the world around you is going to be changing. The dynamics of the things you're trying to change are going to evolve over time. So you got to learn as you go. And there's a sort of cliche in the business we work in that's called a learning organization. We're going to be a whole organization about learning. And I'm a little bit reluctant to sort of characterize Surdna that way, but I think this idea of just the simple idea of learning as you go, having a pretty clear idea, being clear about what your assumptions are, what your strategy is for the work you're doing, but then acknowledging that you're going to learn stuff along the way and feeding that learning back in, testing your assumptions, changing your strategy as you go is a key part of doing this work well. And so a lot of the stuff we've been doing since we developed our first roadmap and we moved along the roadmap, and now we have roadmap 2.0, which moves us a little further down the road, is trying to get clearer about how does that learning actually happen? How do you receive information? Is there information data? Is it stories? Is it reports? How do you actually allow that information and those conversations about the learning that's happening in the field seep into your strategy so that you actually truly do evolve your strategies? And then how do you talk about it as a whole institution? How do the staff people talk with the board about this learning? And so that's a journey we've been on. I think we're getting better at it. We're getting better at talking about places where we screwed up, bets that we made that turned out to be based on faulty assumptions, things that really went well that we want to double down on. We're getting better at talking about those things with each other, but it's a learned skill. It's a learned capacity. It's not something you're born with. And it requires, particularly talking about things that don't work well, requires trust. Because one of the things that happens in institutions that I would say are not as high functioning as I hope Surdna is now is failure is used as a club. And so a club as in a stick, where staff members become terrified of talking about things they didn't do well for fear they'll be punished for it. Because board members look for weakness that they can hold over staff members. That's what happens in institutions that are not comfortable talking about failure, taking risky bets. And I think we've been really working hard to create the safe space the trust that's needed to actually authentically have those conversations so that board members and staff members are learning together. It sounds simple, but boy, it's hard because human nature is to be only talking about the things that went okay to protect yourself. When in fact, as governors of the institution, the board members really thirst for information about all of it, the full texture of things that didn't quite work, things that worked well, so that they can be helpful back to staff to say, right, those are the kind of risks we want to take. Or those are the kind of risks that maybe aren't worth the bet. Let's think again about that. But in a way that's positive, not threatening.
You know,
Absolutely. No, and I think the other side of that, of course, the thing that you have to recognize when you're the philanthropy and you're working with people who are applying to get your funds, you know that they're telling you the nice version of stuff, right? They're pretending a little bit and they're telling you what they think you want to hear. So that the challenge is, of course, that because the foundations are the ones with the money, there's a power imbalance, right? And the foundation program officers and program directors and staff and the presidents have to be always aware of that power imbalance and work extra hard to create real, authentic conversations and relationships with their grantees. And I think, we talked earlier about juxtaposition arts. I feel like when I talk to Roger Cummings or Deanna Cummings, who are the founders of Juxtaposition, we have been working with them long enough, and we've bet a lot on their success, that they're able actually to share with us what's really going on, what's not going well, because they know that we have proven in the past that we've been there to help them, and not to say, oh, right, this is a failure, okay, we're writing you guys off. That's a hard thing to do in philanthropy. If you do it right, it's great, because then everybody benefits, but boy, it's hard to do. It's really hard. Yeah, and we talked, at this board meeting, we were talking about the interrelationship between learning, failure, and risk. And about how those are all really kind of intertwined, because if you're not taking any risks, then you're not doing a lot of failing. And if you're not doing a lot of failing, you're not really learning that much. And if you want real change to happen, you can't just do the same old thing over and over again. You actually have to be willing to stick your neck out and try some new stuff. On the other hand, you don't want to put all of your money into 100% risky bets any more than you want to put all of your money in the stock market. You really want to create a portfolio of things so that you're testing new ideas. You have some tried and true things that are moving forward, some fellowship programs or some other things that are sort of the stock, the basic stock of your work. But you're sort of mixing that with trying out new partnerships, building new alliances, trying out some new policy idea, or in some cases, being out on the barricades and really pressing for change in a way that might blow up in your face. And so it's a very interesting conversation at a family foundation that's nearly 100 years old to talk about what's the risk tolerance here? How do we protect this very important asset that we have, which is our reputation, and yet still be willing to use the reputation as that asset to foster change? It's, as we were talking about, it's not a conversation that you have once and you go, oh, okay, now we know risk, we've figured that out. It's really about tuning your internal compass so that you together have a sort of similar sense of, right, that feels a little bit too far. Or that's not, we should be more aggressive there, and having a common sense between board and staff about what that threshold is, and recognize that also moves over time. Political winds change, some things that felt risky, like gay marriage 5 years ago, not risky much at all anymore. The conventional wisdom is changing. So, this again goes back to learning. You have to keep up with the changes that are happening so you can actually be part of them. Well, I think, so the question of, what do you do when you run into failure is an interesting one, because in philanthropy, failure in philanthropy, failure is often not black and white, not easy to detect, because you're working in complex systems, and the thing you're doing might be a failure in the first 6 months, but if you keep at it for 24 months, you can tip the balance. And so, and there's lots of other ways to talk about the fact that failure is not always so obvious. I mean, I often joke that, it's failure if the person that you're giving the money to steals it and goes to Aruba, right? I mean, it's a failure, I guess, except the people in the Aruba get, economic boom from the money that was stolen. I don't know what. So that's easy, right? But the rest of it, the real stuff that you work on, failure and success are not so easily divided. And that's where the learning piece comes in. The key is to try to create tight enough learning feedback loops so that when you do something, you're not waiting 5 years for information back that tells you what happened in the first few months. So it's really about trying to get good information filtering back into the institution, so at least you have information that can allow you to make judgments about whether something is going the way you expected or not, whether you need to course correct or not. And I would say it's not usually whether you have to course correct, but in what way do you have to course correct? Because you almost always have to course correct one way or the other. And sometimes that can be about giving flexibility to the grantees that you've given money to figure it out as they go. Sometimes it's about conversation that causes you to retool the work that you're doing, but it's almost never exactly what you expect. Right, and when you're funding complex stuff, what data you're looking for that tells you the information you need is elusive, because social change is a complex beast. It's really hard to know. I mean, the funny way I think about it is I worked for 9 years at the German Marshall Fund. The German Marshall Fund's all about transatlantic cooperation. Transatlantic cooperation and understanding that was sort of born from the Marshall Plan that was put in place after World War II to help Western Europe recover after World War II. So the German Marshall Fund carried this noble cause of continuing to create transatlantic cooperation and understanding. You want to know when the best time was to do that work? When George Bush was president in the early 2000s and the Europeans and the Americans were getting along not at all. Because it created all of this energy around, oh my gosh, our governments don't get along. We don't agree on what the heck to do. We don't agree on the Iraq War. We don't agree on genetically modified foods, you name it. So we need an organization like the German Marshall Fund to do work to help us talk better. And so, I don't know, is that a measure of success for the German Marshall Fund because their business went way up during this period of crisis? Or is actually the better measure that the crisis shouldn't have happened at the beginning, so there shouldn't be a German Marshall Fund? I don't know, but that's the kind of complex systems-related change that we're working in at Surdna Foundation as well, where you see changing and shifting happen, and it's not as easy as one might think to sift out whether the individual actions you're taking are actually having a dynamic and direct effect on the thing you're trying to affect, because you're working in this system with lots and lots of thousands of actors, and you're just one. No, it's interesting. People that always ask me, is the job fun? No, fun's not, I wouldn't say fun. Fun is, playing basketball or something, I suppose. I guess what I would say on the question you asked before about, what is it that makes me know Surdna's on the right track? I mean, at some level, there's always anxiety about that, right? Because this is giving away money for a living seems like a really easy thing to do, but it's actually really hard to do well. It's easy to give the money away. It's hard to do it well. And I think, that we hold ourselves to a pretty high standard. We work together to try to figure out what the direction is we're going. But, one of the things I did when I arrived here 7+ years ago was I went around. I was new to Surdna. I had actually not heard of Surdna before I began the interview process. I knew lots of foundations in Surdna's sphere, the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation or the Kresge Foundation. I knew all those folks, but somehow Surdna, because I'd been working internationally and Surdna works domestically in the US, was an institution I had not encountered before. And so one of the things I got to do when I arrived here was to go around and ask people, so what do you think of Surdna? And so I spent about 6 months touring the partners of Surdna, grantees, partner foundations, and one of the things I kept hearing was Surdna is a place of ideas. Surdna is a trusted partner. Surdna had a great, sterling reputation. And so one of the things I said to myself was, whatever you do, don't screw that up. Like that is a key element of what makes Surdna work. And so there may be other things that happen here, but that has to remain true. And I think, it's really hard to tell when you're on the inside. When you're a foundation president, people want to say nice things to you. They hope maybe a check will fall out of your pocket for them or something, I don't know. So you don't really get really good, clear feedback. But I think I sense, and I think I have some good evidence to suggest that Surdna remains a respected partner in the world. We're asked often to be at the table for conversations. Our staff members are, I think, leaders, often quietly and modesty, but leaders in their fields, of the fields that they're working in. And they're creating networks of their peer groups in a way that really has Surdna, I think Surdna in the right conversations and really bringing Surdna's sensibility about social justice, about sustainability, about the way the work has to interact with each other to those conversations in a way that I know is shaping those conversations differently than would be the case if Surdna wasn't at the table. And so that's something I feel like is a key marker that I keep in mind that helps me know whether we're tracking well or not.